Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Muriel Bowser. We are located at the District's Emergency Operations Center, where we just concluded a half-day public safety summit. We were pleased to welcome members of our law enforcement community, both local and federal, as well as interested stakeholders who support in one way or another public safety in the district. I especially want to acknowledge the Chief Judge for the D.C. Superior Court, Anita Josie Herring, the U.S. Attorney for the district, Matthew Graves, and the Attorney General for the district, Brian Schwab, and thank them for their presentations. I also want to acknowledge my public safety cluster, led by Deputy Mayor Apia, and all of our D.C. government comms officials and law enforcement staff who really worked hard to put these panels together. I want to acknowledge the chair of the Council's Judiciary Committee, Brooke Pinto, who participated in a panel, as well as several council members who participated, including Ward 8 Council Member Trayon White. So with that, we will take questions on the summit. Yes, ma'am.
Mayor, a lot of the topics discussed today, incredibly important. You've also been working on this for a while. We've heard a lot of these conversations before. What is something new for you that came out of the summit today?
Well, one thing that we did differently, Stephanie, and it was important for us to share with the community some of what MPD and other law enforcement officials do weekly. And that's really review a week in the life of how we're fighting crime in the districts, focused on MPD. So we spent some time going through the cases, showing different parts of the city, showing different levels or stages in the investigative process to outline some of the crime and difficulties that we are addressing. I think that we continue to hear from different parts of the system what would be helpful. I think what was important for me was to listen to community members in the breakout sessions about the one thing that they would do differently or think we need to do differently. So there was a lot of discussion in our breakout about supporting and focusing on the whole family, having strategies that allow for mandatory services for young people without them being convicted or committed to the system, and also talking about schools and tools that our schools have to support young people being in school.
That's going to come out of today then?
We are gathering information and we will be using some of what we learned to talk about changes that we need to the law or to our policies. But I also think that something was new, at least I'm not sure I've ever seen it before, was to have our Chief Judge and the United States Attorney answer questions about public safety in the district. You all get to ask me about public safety in the district all the time. And so it was very refreshing for me to see the types of questions, and it's in that you represent what your viewers or readers want to hear about, to hear some of those questions to other parts of our public safety ecosystem. Yes.
So yesterday I did a story about dozens of shots that were fired on Queen Stroll Place in Southeast. A guy was hit in his bedroom. The neighbors were telling me they have contacted police and DCHA for years and nothing has been done. So when you talk about crime, especially repeat offenders, specifically there's one drug house that they said nothing's been being done. Where is the communication or lack of communication between the police and DCHA to keep these people off the streets and keep that particular block safe?
Well, thank you for mentioning one of our public safety partners, and I'll turn to the chief. I don't know the specifics about that incident, but one thing that we know we have to do in this city is to tap into all of our law enforcement partners for presence, for investigative help, and to fill the gaps on some of the calls for service that MPD might receive. The Housing Authority is one such agency that has a police force. There were a number of chiefs and personnel in the room earlier from our university partners who also have police forces and can help with presence throughout the city. So I'll turn to the chief to see if he knows about that one, and we may have to get back to you.
Thank you for the question. So just kind of picking up where the mayor left off, talking about gaps. So to your point, this specific case, I'm not sure of all the specific details, but the gaps that you kind of highlighted in what you said, like it's been a problem for years, and the police or whatever. You talked about the police, keeping that area safe. That is important, but as we learned today, there are other parts to the criminal justice system that impacts what happens in that block, that house. How many times has that particular house where people been arrested back out in community, or whatever the issues may be there? I think what we learned today, and what hopefully community members learn today, that the issues go beyond just the police making an arrest and the problem just goes away. One of the things that the U.S. Attorney talked about that a lot of people may have missed, he talked about a different burden that they face versus what law enforcement faces. For example, our burden, our threshold to make an arrest is probable cause. He talked about having the burden of being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt at the time that we're moving a case forward in order to ensure accountability. So when you're talking about gaps within the system, there's certainly gaps there. And what I'm hopeful at the end of all of this, as we work to really kind of close up those gaps, now that we have these things that have been publicly talked about, that there is follow-up all the way within the ecosystem, or all throughout the ecosystem, rather, to shore up those holes so that that house that you mentioned, or those repeat offenders, are not back in community time and time again, creating havoc and unsafe environments for community members.
Well, just jumping off of what Chief Conti said about repeat offenders, you mentioned in there in the Q&A portion that you were considering changing the presumption, and the U.S. Attorney said he would support this, changing the presumption that allows people who are charged to be released into community before they stand trial. Can you give us more details about that, the sort of data you looked at to show that people who are being released are reoffending, are creating these sorts of issues?
What we're looking at are reoffenders. We are looking at people who have been convicted of a violent crime and are arrested for a violent crime. And we are very focused on that because we have a lot of instances right now of people who have been arrested for a violent crime, like homicide, who haven't been detained. And we think the expectations in the community is that if you've committed a violent crime, you're convicted of a violent crime, and you commit another one, that you should be detained. Yep.
My understanding is that under current DC law, that's already the case. If you commit a violent crime and your previous record shows that you have past violent criminal convictions, that already weighs in favor of detention pretrial. So what would be different?
I don't know that I would agree with that assessment. That's certainly not how the judges describe it. Yep.
Councilmember White said that he had some concerns. There was a disconnect between the attorney's office and parts of the legal system, and I believe the chief was kind of talking about gaps right now. From where you stand as mayor, are you concerned about a disconnect in the legal system when it comes to charging offenders?
Well, I don't want to put words in the chief's mouth, but I think to put it very colloquially, what we hear, what I hear is that if I'm not assured that I'm going to get a conviction, then I'm not going to try. And if I'm not assured that I'm going to get a conviction on day 7, I'm not going to try. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, so I have to trust in folks who are and have that experience. But from the outside looking in, people are concerned that one might be more concerned about their conviction rates than they are about working and trying cases. And nobody is going to advocate for wasting prosecutorial resources And no one's advocating for people violating their ethics or charging people when there's no reason to charge people. But we want, just like we're taking a double look at every process that we have, we expect that all parts of the system are doing the same. So I have to take people at their word that they're doing their work diligently and according to their ethics, because that's what I charge my team with doing. But I also know that people expect for us all to be working towards the goal, and that's the immediate, urgent, fair administration of justice in our city. Yep.
So kind of staying with that and the USAO's comments, and Chief, I think this is probably more directed at you. You know, what the USAO pointed to really 3 reasons for the lack of prosecutions, and 2 of them go right back to your officers. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said your officers are making arrests without probable cause, and they're also violating people's constitutional rights at some point when they're making those stops. So how do you, and that seems like something that should be fixed on your end.
No, I didn't take that away from it, Mark. I mean, certainly we see those as issues at times, but again, it's really, it gets back to the burden. The burden for the Metropolitan Police Department to make an arrest is to have probable cause, right? Which, if you talk to a judge, if you talk to a prosecutor, the bar is here, probable cause. What the U.S. Attorney is talking about, for them to advance a case, for them to move that case forward, they're asking for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what is required for conviction. And that is a that is a serious difference there in terms of what the burden of proof is for MPD to make an arrest versus what their burden of proof is to get a conviction at trial. At the time that somebody commits a violent act on the streets of the District of Columbia and an arrest is made at that point of a violent offender, the immediate focus is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Do we have a set of facts, circumstances, or reliable information that leads us to believe that this person engaged in whatever crime it was and that we have enough information to make an arrest at that time? A lot of times we do. If it does not meet that burden that he's talking about, that the U.S. Attorney referenced, when you're talking about the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, they make a decision at that point. When they make that decision not to move that case forward, it doesn't mean that the police officers did something wrong. Again, I think one of the commanders earlier talked about the firearm that's tossed from the guy who's running down the alley, but the body-worn camera did not capture it. Who makes the determination about whether or not that case moves forward? We made the determination that that person should be arrested because our officer chased him. He heard the gun going across the ground, but there's a decision that's made at that point to not prosecute the case because it wasn't captured on body-worn camera. That's not anything that we have control over. We meet with the U.S. Attorney's Office every month, and what we ask of them is that if you see trends, if you see things that show up that are issues for MPD, those issues are brought to my attention, and the U.S. Attorney will tell you those issues are addressed immediately, whether it's through training, policy, etc. But I will tell, and he also said, the other part too, is as he talked about looking at just the myriad of cases that exist. A lot of the cases, misdemeanor, this is that, he's talking about the prosecution rate for his office. I'm talking specifically about what the burden is when we arrest versus when they do what they do in terms of making decisions to move cases forward. The last thing I will say about this, is this. There is a law on the book, right, that has to be examined, and the mayor talked about this with this presumption piece, right? If the presumption right now, if judges are mandated, they are required to release people back into the community, which happens right now because of a law enacted in the District of Columbia back in 1992, if we're required to do that, to me, it just seems that we should be looking at that to figure out what is the best way for us to make the adjustment so that that does not allow, so that we don't have laws on the book that allows for violent criminals to be back in our community. I think that is very important, and I'm very hopeful that we'll get there.
Mayor, you kind of called the USAO out on one of the other issues that he mentioned, which was DFS not being able to test drugs, and you pointed out, probably correctly, that the USAO has resources at their disposal that they could test the drugs, and I guess are choosing not to. there was a lot of talk about DFS and a timeline and accreditation, but can somebody, maybe the CA, tell us, like, when do you expect the DC Forensics Lab to be back online and providing the evidence that prosecutors need to pursue cases?
Well, prosecutors have evidence to pursue cases, and we have made arrangements, or they have made arrangements to use independent labs. So that's why I want to make that perfectly clear. And if we identify additional resource needs that they have, we can work with them to get there. The larger point that we were making about DFS, Mark, is that I believe structurally it has to change because of my experience in the last 8 years is that DFS has been upended by the U.S. Attorney on 2 different occasions. And it has to do with us having an independent lab with the U.S. Attorney as our basically our sole customer. And so what we don't want to, I don't want 5 years from now to be dealing with the same issue. So I asked my team to really look at what we need to do with DFS to make sure that it's sustainable for now and sustainable for the future. And that's what Kevin described. So I'm going to ask him just to say a little bit more about the process.
Sure. So in the past few days, DFS has a new interim director, Dr. Diaz, who's the chief medical examiner, who knows scientific accreditation very well. He has done it and sustained it every place he's worked. So he's taking a close look at what the realistic timing would be to bring back online, particularly some of the DNA work that's so essential for closing cases. The 2 legislative proposals that are very important that will help, I think, get DFS back to accreditation faster. One is having DFS really be an agency whose structure reflects its core mission, which is safely testing evidence with integrity. And so over time, DFS has taken on additional roles and responsibilities, namely crime scene sciences, which actually did not start with DFS. We moved it there in about 2016, 2017, as well as the public health lab. And it really is to having DFS and all the energy in it focused squarely on getting it back to accreditation for its core forensic work. So not having to, at the same time, think about how to manage evidence collection on crime scenes, which MPD often does right now anyway, and a public health lab, which can be housed in the health department. The second core component is to make sure DFS has both a strong science advisory board, but a reporting chain that remains with the mayor. The Science Advisory Board and its strength protect DFS from outside influence and help be at the basis for giving assessments of any questions raised about the quality of the work that it does. The value and importance to me of DFS remaining an agency that's part of the mayor's chain of command is this. One, I think reporting to a mayor helps protect DFS when it's combined with the strong Science Advisory Board. Without that protection, the agency can be a bit on its own. The second thing that I didn't fully appreciate until I got involved in recruiting the next director of DFS is it's a job that's going to be a challenge to recruit an outstanding leader for. The prior 2 directors left abruptly after having long, good careers. And the expectation of every qualified person that I've talked to, and I've talked to every qualified candidate who's expressed interest, is they would like the agency to have a chain of command that reflects what they see everywhere else in the country, which is generally a chain of command that leads to the elected executive, in this case the mayor. And it makes it much easier to recruit a permanent, qualified, experienced new head of DFS.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. Sam?
Yes, Mayor. I guess I kind of sense, too, some kind of, let's say, finger pointing to some degree at the from the executive to the judicial. Obviously, as the executive, you and the chief are the ones that catch the flack.
You didn't see any finger pointing from us.
Well, I think I did.
Oh, okay.
But
tell me more.
But anyway, the thing that kind of got me, I guess, more than anything else in this whole thing was that the U.S. Attorney said that basically, unless you were admitting that that this was drugs, that you sold drugs, that they didn't prosecute you because they couldn't prove it from the Department of Forensic Sciences. So I don't know, as you all are trying to come about this, one, is this the first time you all have kind of talked to each other, the executive and the judicial? And going forward, it looks like you may be handicapped because, one, the chief judge says they don't have enough judges, and the chief prosecutor says, well, they just can't prosecute people from drug crimes because they don't have the evidence.
I don't know if that's what he said. I wouldn't agree with that, him not having the ability to get anything that he wants tested.
He said occasionally they go to DNA, but for the most part, because I went up to and asked, I said, is this the case? Because I couldn't believe my ears.
So actually what he said is that we now have a contract in place that we recognize that what is going on with DFS, but we have put in place a host of outsourcing, including what he said is that the executive has worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office now to have contracts in place so that they can test drugs. Yeah, I can pull the contract date.
Because I asked him, he said, basically, unless they say this is cocaine, yes, then they had to let it go. So I guess tons of people arrested for drug crimes just got to walk.
I will have to direct you to the United States Attorney about that, but I would find that to be wholly unacceptable. That the U.S. Attorney would say that he doesn't have access to labs. Yes.
One additional deal on that point, though, what Sam was talking about with the handicapped part. I mean, are you concerned if the USAO is still neglecting or saying that he's not going to prosecute, that you guys are handcuffed?
This points to a fundamental problem of our home rule. That in any other place in the United States of America, prosecutors are accountable to the voters. In the District of Columbia, they are not. And I think what we heard even more, and I did find this to be surprising, that the United States Attorney for the district doesn't have a data analyst that can help track cases and where cases are. I'm pleased that they do now, but we have data analysts, in the government, MPD, and across DC government, and so there may be opportunities for partnership. He talked a lot about decisions around misdemeanors and prosecuting misdemeanors. We have prosecutors. The Office of the Attorney General has prosecutors that could handle more misdemeanor prosecution. So these are things that maybe we need to explore in partnership. And I'm not being cute when I say this, but we're watching prosecutions right now. He mentioned one that have to do with national security, and that is the job for the U.S. Attorney for the district as well. So we know tapping into DOJ resources is certainly something at his disposal. Yep. I'm going to take just a few more, and then we'll wrap up. Yep. Martin, and then Stephanie, and then we'll be done.
Well, just continuing on this theme of questions, I mean, you saw what the USAO said about his level, the proof he has to go forward with to actually prosecute a case versus what police can use to arrest. He didn't seem to indicate that he was going to budge a lot because of the situation with home rule. There's not a lot that you can do to force him to budge. So is there a solution to be had there to hope that he takes more of the cases that you guys are sending his way?
I actually think that the light of day on all parts of the ecosystem is working. I have to tell you. The briefing that I got about holds, about charges, about cases moving forward, I've had briefings like that from MPD that didn't sound anything like that. I opened up the Washington Post. I'm reading about cases that are advancing, and I see a difference. And I think people asking questions, demonstrating the impacts that the crime is having on them personally and on their communities and on the city as a whole. I think all of those things are helpful. Again, we start at a place that everybody wants to do their job earnestly, but we do think talking with each other about our challenges and being really introspective. I was serious when I said that I wanted to look at the workings of my agencies to make sure that if there's something that we can do differently, we're doing it. If it's something that we haven't been doing well, we change it. And I continue to call on everybody to do that. Yes.
Mayor, the police chief gave a stat earlier today, and he was noting how at the start of 2020 there were less juvenile arrests as part of not wanting to introduce youth to the criminal justice system, and that it was found that by the end of 2022, or in all of 2022, 31% of 381 juveniles arrested for violent crime were arrested for their first offense as a violent crime offense. Is this an admission here that something went wrong?
Okay, I'm not sure that I'm following that question.
Spoke of how there was intention there behind starting in 2020 to arrest less juveniles as part of not wanting to introduce juveniles to the criminal justice system. And then 2 years later, the stats are saying that 31% of 381 juveniles arrested for violent crime, that was their first arrest, was for a violent crime offense.
I mean, I think if you're referring to the years 2020, there was a big movement across the country to keep people out of congregate settings. And so that may be reflected in those numbers.
And then the other question, there was a MPD leader who was at the juvenile breakout session, and the question that she had asked everyone in the room was, these are all important topics, but what could be done right now to address crime right now? This whole summit, where we've heard everything, what is coming out of this to address crime right now?
I believe I answered that question in the first round when you asked your first question. Do you have a different question?
Can you tell me again, right now,
But
to address crime right
I
now?
told you once that we are listening. I can tell you again, but I just want everybody to acknowledge you've asked me the same question already. But I'll answer it again. And as I said then, there are things that we are learning from what we heard. There are gaps that we think that we identified, some of which came out of the session that you were in. That we will advance in legislation, and we will look at any other policy changes that don't require legislation. All right, thank you.